Carlos, at 38, was the personification of the success that money can buy. A financial empire built on the ashes of a marriage broken 2 years ago. Each new contract, each million acquired, was one more layer of armor over a heart that he himself had decreed as closed for business. On that Saturday night, he was in his natural habitat, the most expensive restaurant in the city, a sanctuary of luxury and power. At his side, Camila, a model whose beauty seemed more like an accessory than a companion, a gleaming trophy that confirmed his status. He raised his glass, celebrating another closed deal, feeling the taste of victory, but deep down, a stubborn emptiness, a silent echo in his chest, whispered that something fundamental had been lost along the way. It was then that his world, so carefully constructed, stopped spinning. A waitress approached the table to take the order, and for an instant, she was just another anonymous employee. But then, their eyes met, and the air fled. From Carlos's lungs, it was Isadora. His Isadora. Her face was more tired, with dark circles that denounced poorly slept nights, but the dignity was still there, intact. And to his complete shock, the waitress uniform barely contained the prominent curve of a 7-month pregnant belly. The crystal glass in his hand trembled, and Camilla's voice became a distant hum. That was the same restaurant where, years ago, they had toasted to their engagement, a ghost from the past that now haunted him in the most painful and unexpected way possible. For Isadora, that encounter was like a lightning bolt that splits a tree in half, exposing all her frailties at once. A heat of pure humiliation rose up her face, and for a second, she felt her legs weaken under the weight of her own body and of the little life she carried. There he was, Carlos, the architect of her greatest happiness and also of her deepest pain. Exactly the same, with his expensive suit and his air of someone who owns the world. And beside him, a woman who was the picture of the unattainable perfection she once believed she needed to be. Instinct screamed for her to turn her back and run to the safety of the kitchen, away from those eyes that analyzed her. But the Isadora of now was different. Life had forced her to swallow her pride and transform it into strength. Her hand went instinctively to her belly, a protective gesture, a silent reminder of for whom she fought. Taking a deep breath, she lifted her chin, a queen, in her servant's uniform, and forced her voice to come out steady, holding the small notepad as if it were a shield. Her eyes, however, could not hide the storm of hurt that was forming. Carlos's initial shock quickly metamorphosed into a whirlwind of guilt and regret, so violent that it left him physically sick. Every detail of the scene was a dagger in his chest. Her hands, which he once covered in jewels, now calloused from work. The glint of exhaustion in her eyes, which once only reflected love for him. And the belly, that living proof that her life had moved on in a hard and lonely way. The opulence of the restaurant, which minutes before was a symbol of his power, now seemed grotesque, an affront to Isadora's struggle. Camila, noticing the drastic change in his expression, touched his arm and asked with a futile voice, "Carlos, dear, what is it? You look like you've seen a ghost." And he had. A ghost of himself, of the man he could have been. Unable to articulate a single word, he stood up abruptly. The noise of the chair dragging on the polished floor caught the attention of a few tables. He threw a handful of 100 real bills on the linen tablecloth, more than enough to cover a dozen dinners, and without looking back marched out of the restaurant, leaving Camila open-mouthed and Isadora paralyzed, with the order stuck in her throat. Outside, the cold August night air hit Carlos like a slap, but it wasn't enough to put out the fire consuming his insides. He walked, aimlessly for a few meters, the sound of horns and the city mixing into a chaotic hum in his mind, before leaning against a building's wall, breathless, as if he had run a marathon. The image of Isadora would not leave his retina. The tiredness in her eyes, the forced dignity, the belly that represented an entire universe of which he was not a part. He remembered a night, years ago, when she caught a bad flu and he spent the early hours by her side, taking her temperature and making sure she ate the soup he had prepared himself. "You'll always take care of me, won't you?" she had asked, her voice weak. "Always," he had answered, feeling like a giant, a protector. The memory now crushed him. What kind of man had he become? One who flaunted his wealth while the woman he once swore to protect served tables to survive, carrying another man's child. His entire empire, all the luxury cars, the apartment with a panoramic view, it all turned to ashes, to a testament of his monumental failure as a human being. The emptiness he felt was not an absence, it was an overwhelming presence of guilt. While Carlos was devoured by his own conscience on the sidewalk, Isadora remained in the center of the hurricane. The humming in her ears was so loud that she barely heard. When Camilla, recovered from the initial shock, stood up and stopped before her. The model's fury was palpable, her blue eyes sparking with contempt. "What did you do to him? What did you say?" Her voice was a venomous hiss, low, so as not to create a bigger scene, but loaded with humiliation. Is this some kind of scam? Showing up pregnant at his favorite restaurant to try to get some money? You poor people are all the same, always looking for a shortcut. Each word was a small cut, but Isadora refused to bleed. She looked at the woman before her, a porcelain doll who understood nothing about real life, and felt a wave of strength coming directly from her daughter Sophia. She didn't answer the accusation. She just straightened her posture and said with a glacial calm that surprised herself, "If you'll excuse me, I have other customers to attend to." Without waiting for a reply, she turned and walked toward the kitchen, feeling Camilla's gaze burning her back. Only when she crossed the swinging doors and the noise of dishes and pans enveloped her, did she allow herself to falter, leaning against the cold wall and closing her eyes, her heart beating like a trapped bird. Carlos finally found his way to his car, an oasis of leather and technology that on that night seemed as strange and impersonal as a hotel room. He drove for hours, aimlessly, the city's neon lights passing like colored blurs through the windshield, each one a reminder of the superficialities he had pursued. The powerful engine was a silent murmur compared to the shouting in his soul. Finally, he pulled over on a dark residential street, the kind of place he never frequented, and picked up his phone. Camilla's name glowed on the screen. With a finger that felt like it weighed a ton, he called. She answered on the first ring, her voice a mixture of fury and concern. He didn't let her speak. "It's over, Camilla," he said, and the voice that came out was not his. It lacked the arrogance, the tone of command. It was the hollow voice of a broken man. "What? What are you talking about, Carlos? You can't do this," she protested. But he could. At that moment, he realized that this was the first mandatory step on a pilgrimage he didn't even know how to begin. It was a penance. He needed to strip himself of everything that represented the man he was in the restaurant. "Goodbye, Camilla." He hung up before she could respond, throwing the phone on the passenger seat. The silence that followed was the first real thing he had felt in 2 years. Hours later, when the restaurant finally closed its doors, Isadora felt as if every bone in her body ached. The night's humiliation had turned into a deep exhaustion, which went far beyond the physical fatigue of carrying a tray and a life in her womb for hours on end. The journey home was her daily test of endurance. The night bus, with its smell of metal and cheap disinfectant, was almost empty, and every jolt seemed to echo in her soul. Resting her head on the cold window, she watched the sleeping city pass by, and the tears she had held back so forcefully finally came, silent and bitter. She didn't cry for the humiliation, not even for Camilla's cruelty. She cried for the injustice of having her painful past thrown in her face, just when she was beginning to believe she could build a future, however modest it might be. Why did he have to show up? Why now? She caressed her belly, a safe harbor amidst the storm. "I'm sorry, my daughter," she whispered into the darkness. "Mommy will be stronger. For you." That encounter had rekindled a pain she thought had scarred over, the pain of a love that had become unrecognizable, eroded by ambition and by Carlos's emotional distance long before the divorce. As she got off at her stop and walked down the poorly lit street to her small apartment, a new determination solidified in her heart. She was no longer the same woman he had left behind. She was a survivor, and she would not let him break her again. The night was a long and torturous blur for Carlos. He didn't sleep, didn't even try. He remained in his silent apartment, which now seemed more like a mausoleum of his own empty achievements, as the sun rose over the city, painting the sky with colors he hadn't seen in years. A decision formed amidst the chaos of his mind, a single, fragile line of hope. He needed to see her again, not in the role of a rich and powerful client, but as the man he should have been. The next afternoon, long before her shift began, he was already there, not at his usual table, but across the street, leaning against his car like an insecure teenager, watching the restaurant's entrance. Every person who passed by made him feel like an intruder in his own past. He saw when she got off the bus at the corner, walking slowly, with the weight of the world and her pregnancy in every step. In that instant, the man who commanded meetings with dozens of directors felt his heart race and his hands sweat. He crossed the street, his heart hammering against his ribs, and gently stopped her before she could enter. "Isadora," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "Please, just a minute. I need to talk to you." Isadora saw Carlos crossing the street towards her and felt a chill of pure apprehension. A part of her, the most tired part, had been expecting it. Men like Carlos, accustomed to fixing everything with grand gestures or the power of their money, couldn't simply accept a situation like the one from the night before. His presence there, with his tired face and pleading eyes, didn't cause her compassion, but rather a deep irritation. To her, this wasn't about her or the baby. It was about him, about the stain on his perfect biography, about the guilt that scratched his millionaire's armor. He wanted to erase the discomfort he felt, and she would be the tool for it. Her hand rested on Sophia, a reflex act of protection against the disturbance he represented. She didn't even stop walking, forcing him to keep up with her for a few steps. "No, Carlos," she answered, her voice as cold as the steel life had forged around her. "We have absolutely nothing to talk about. I'm late for work." She didn't look at him as she said this, keeping her focus on the restaurant door, her only goal. Leaving him behind on the sidewalk, standing and speechless, was the first act of self-defense she had committed against him in years, and although it brought her no joy, it brought a somber sense of justice. She would not be anyone's redemption project. Her rejection, cold and sharp, should have hurt his pride, and it did. But to Carlos's own amazement, it didn't discourage him. On the contrary, the pain of that indifference seemed fair to him, a small portion of the penance he had barely begun to pay. He watched her disappear through the restaurant door, and instead of leaving, he remained there for another hour, just looking at the building's facade, as if he could, with the force of his repentance, see through the walls and protect her. That act of repudiation became the fuel for a new and obstinate determination. The next day, he was there again, at the same time, in the same place. And the day after that, he no longer tried to stop her or force a conversation. His tactic shifted to one of silent and constant presence. He became a sentinel of his own remorse, just nodding his head when she passed, or, on bolder days, murmuring, "Have a good shift, Isadora." He endured the curious glances of the other employees and the humiliation of being ignored by her day after day. It was a ritual of self-flagellation, a way of proving perhaps more to himself than to her that his change was not a fleeting impulse, but a transformation he was willing to suffer to deserve. For Isadora, Carlos's persistence was, at first, a source of immense irritation. His daily presence was like a stone in her shoe, a constant complication that prevented her from fully immersing herself in the armor of indifference she needed to survive her day. She ignored him with an iron discipline, passing by him as if he were part of the urban landscape, a lamppost or a trash can. However, secretly, in the silence of her small apartment at night, she couldn't stop the image of him standing on the sidewalk with slumped shoulders and the expression of a lost dog from invading her thoughts. It was disconcerting. The Carlos she knew was impatient, domineering, and proud. He would never submit to such humiliation. This new version, silent and resigned, began to corrode the edges of her certainty. After almost a week of this silent siege, his tactic changed again. On a particularly cold afternoon, as she approached, he took a step forward, but this time it wasn't words he offered. He held a thermal pot that exuded a comforting steam. "I know the food here isn't ideal, and you barely have time to eat," he said, his voice low and careful. "It's just chicken soup. I remember it was your favorite when you got sick. Please accept it. If not for you, think of the baby." He held out the pot, a peace offering that was much more than just food. It was a memory, a gesture of care, and a precise weapon aimed directly at the only chink in her defense, her daughter. Isadora stood paralyzed, her gaze fixed on the thermal pot as if it were an artifact from another planet. The familiar smell of the soup, with the touch of mint she alone knew he used to add, snaked through her nostrils, awakening a hunger she had been ignoring and a memory she was trying to suppress. Her mind waged a furious battle. Pride, forged in iron and fire over the last 2 years, screamed for her to refuse, to throw it in his face that she didn't need his charity. His crumbs of guilt turned into soup. It was a trick, a maneuver to make her lower her guard. But then, the reality of her situation hit her with the force of a punch. She was exhausted, her swollen feet ached, and the last decent meal she'd had was a cold sandwich from the day before. And then, the final and irrefutable argument, Sophia. Her daughter kicked lightly, as if agreeing with Carlos. To deny it would be to punish the child for her own hurt. Slowly, with a reluctance that was almost palpable, she reached out her hand. Her fingers brushed against his as she took the pot, an electric contact that sent a wave of heat up her arm. She didn't say a word, just an almost imperceptible nod, before turning and entering the restaurant, leaving him behind with a pounding heart, celebrating the most significant of his victories. During her short break, hidden in the small and noisy employee break room, Isadora opened the pot. The steam warmed her tired face. With a borrowed plastic spoon, she tasted the soup, and in that instant, a barrage of emotions flooded her. The taste was exactly as she remembered it, an echo of a time when his care was the safest thing in her world. Every spoonful was both a torture and a balm. It was proof that he remembered the small details, the little intimacies she believed he had discarded along with their marriage. This was much more dangerous than his apologies or his silent presence. It was an act of service, of nourishment, an invasion of her most intimate space through an undeniably kind gesture. The tears came without her being able to control them, falling silently into the hot soup. They were tears of confusion, of anger at her own vulnerability, of a deep sadness for this man she now saw as neither the hero she had loved nor the villain she had learned to hate, but something much more complicated. When she finished, the empty pot before her seemed like a trophy of surrender in a battle she didn't even know she was losing. From that moment on, she knew nothing would be so simple again. The chicken soup was not an isolated event. It was the inauguration of a new and strange routine. The next day, Carlos was there, and in place of the thermal pot, he brought a small bag with a plate of grilled fish and steamed vegetables. The day after, it was a pumpkin risotto. He became Isadora's private and silent chef. Every afternoon, the scene repeated with an almost choreographed precision. She would arrive, he would approach, extend the day's meal, and she would accept. The transaction was almost always silent, but a new kind of communication was being born between them. The next morning, Isadora would leave the previous day's glass container, washed and dried at the restaurant's reception, a gesture Carlos interpreted as tacit permission to continue. For him, those daily minutes were the high point of his existence. But his role as an observer now had a new focus. He no longer saw just the woman he had hurt. He saw the worrying details. He noticed the growing pallor under her skin, the way she discreetly rested her hand on her back to relieve a constant ache, the breath that seemed to get shorter each day. The initial guilt was giving way to a genuine and deep fear for her health and the baby's. He realized that just feeding her was not enough. She was exhausting herself before his eyes. This latent concern exploded into panic on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Isadora seemed even more exhausted than usual, and when Carlos approached with the day's meal, he saw that she could barely keep her eyes open. The moment she reached out to take the bag, her face lost all its color. She let out a low, sharp groan, staggering to the side, one hand flying to her belly in a gesture of pain and protection. Carlos's world narrowed to that single terrifying moment. Fear, cold and absolute, overcame all his hesitation and remorse. In a swift and instinctive movement, he dropped the bag on the ground, the sound of breaking glass barely registering in his mind, and lunged forward, wrapping his arms around her seconds before she fell onto the wet sidewalk. "Isadora! For God's sake, what is it?" he shouted, his voice hoarse with dread. He held her tightly, feeling the fragile weight of her body against his. In that instant of crisis, all barriers, all hurts, and all pride were pulverized. It was just the two of them, a terrified man and the woman he loved in his arms, clearly in need of immediate help. Carlos's panic was a force of nature, a wave that swept away any remnant of hesitation. Ignoring the gazes of the few pedestrians who stopped to watch the scene, he knelt, holding Isadora with a firmness that was at once desperate and gentle. "Isadora, look at me, talk to me. Where does it hurt? Is it the baby?" His voice was a command, but one born of pure terror. She, her face contorted in pain, managed to whisper only a few words between ragged breaths. "A sharp pain, very strong in my belly." That was all Carlos needed to hear. The idea of waiting for an ambulance, of losing a single second, was unbearable. In a fraction of a second, he made the decision. Without asking permission, without thinking of the implications, he slid one arm under her knees and the other around her back, lifting her from the ground. The astonishment in Isadora's eyes was visible, even amidst the pain. To be carried by him after so long was a bare physical and emotional surrender she had never imagined. He carried her the few meters to his car with a fierce urgency, opening the passenger door and settling her into the soft leather seat with infinite care, as if she were the most precious and fragile thing in the universe. The journey to the hospital was a blur of imaginary sirens and tires screeching on the wet asphalt. Carlos drove with manic concentration, the outside world reduced to a tunnel of obstacles to be overcome. He didn't care about the red lights or the furious horns of other drivers. His only mission was to get to the emergency room of the best private hospital in the city, a place whose doors Isadora could never have crossed on her own. Beside him, Isadora curled up in the seat, fighting against the waves of pain and the whirlwind of confusion in her mind. Being cared for by him in this way was surreal. The image of the proud, distant man who left her dissolved with every risky maneuver he made for her. Every time, he looked at her with eyes full of genuine panic and murmured, "Hang in there, we're almost there." She tried to cling to her distrust, to her narrative that this was all a show to ease his guilt, but it was impossible. Guilt didn't explain the terror in his voice, nor the way his hand trembled slightly as he touched her shoulder to comfort her. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to consider a terrifying truth. Maybe he still cared, and that possibility was almost as overwhelming as the physical pain she felt. The moment the luxury car screeched to a halt at the emergency entrance, Carlos was already in combat mode. He jumped out of the vehicle and, before the valets could even react, opened Isadora's door and shouted into the lobby with an authority that made people move. "I need a gurney. A 7 months pregnant woman now." In seconds, a team of nurses and orderlies appeared, and Isadora was transferred from the car seat to the gurney with impressive efficiency. As they wheeled her inside, Carlos was already at the admission desk, wallet in hand. He didn't fill out forms, he gave orders. Private room, the best obstetrician on duty, all necessary tests. I don't care about the cost. He threw his black credit card on the counter, a gesture that silenced any bureaucratic questioning. For Isadora, watching everything from a lying position, the scene was dizzying. She, who was used to endless lines and the indifference of the public health system, was being treated as a top-level emergency. She saw Carlos's power in action, not to buy a company or a yacht, but to ensure her safety and that of her daughter. And this raw display of power, used entirely in her favor, was more persuasive than any apology he could formulate. The following hours dragged on in a torture of silence and anxiety. Carlos refused to leave the antechamber of the room where Isadora was being examined, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. Every time a door opened, his heart leaped, his mind painting the worst-case scenarios. He ignored a nurse's gentle attempts to get him to have a coffee or wait in a more comfortable room. His place was there. Finally, a serious and competent-looking doctor came out of the room, taking off his glasses. Carlos intercepted him immediately. "Doctor, how is she? Is the baby okay?" The doctor looked at him with a grave expression. "We've managed to stabilize her. It was a spike of extremely high blood pressure, combined with a strong contraction, a clear warning sign. I'll be direct, sir. Her condition is the result of extreme stress and physical exhaustion. From the preliminary exams, she also shows signs of malnutrition. This work pace she maintains is unsustainable and dangerous. She is putting herself and the pregnancy at very high risk. My recommendation is clear and non-negotiable. Absolute and immediate rest until the day of delivery." Every word from the doctor was a confirmation of Carlos's deepest fears, but also a validation. It wasn't in his head. The danger was real, and upon hearing the diagnosis, a new and unshakable certainty took hold of him. He would no longer allow it. The discussion was over. With the doctor's sentence echoing in his mind, Carlos took a deep breath and entered the room. Isadora was lying down, her face pale against the white of the sheets, looking incredibly fragile. The sight of her there, connected to a gently beeping monitor, was a dagger in his heart. He pulled a chair close to the bed, sitting so that his eyes were level with hers, a gesture of humility he would never have considered in the past. "Isadora," he began, his voice low and laden with a seriousness she had never heard from him. "I spoke with the doctor. Your blood pressure is very high because of the stress and exertion. He was very clear. You need absolute rest until the end of the pregnancy. Absolute. That means you can't go back to that restaurant. You can't." He paused, letting the weight of those words settle in the silence of the room. "I know you don't want to hear this from me, but I have to ask. Come live in my apartment, please." Seeing the no forming on her lips, he hurried to continue, the words tumbling out in a desperate flow. "Not like you're thinking, I swear on my life. We'll just be housemates. The apartment has 4 bedrooms. You'll have your own, with your own bathroom, your total privacy. I can even sleep in the guest room on the other side of the house. The only goal is your safety and Sophia's. You'll have peace, food, comfort. No demands, no ulterior motives. Just let me take care of you both. Let me do the right thing, just this once." The no was on the tip of Isadora's tongue, an automatic response, a survival reflex of her wounded pride. The idea of living under Carlos's roof, in his world, was a capitulation she didn't feel ready to make. It would be like admitting defeat, like going back to being the dependent woman she had fought so hard to leave behind. She opened her mouth to refuse, to say she would find a way, as she always had. But then reality hit her with the force of a train. The doctor's words, the icy fear she felt when the pain hit her on the sidewalk, the image of herself fainting alone in her small apartment with no one to help, and above all, the thought of Sophia. She no longer had the right to make decisions based solely on her pride. Her daughter depended entirely on her to arrive in this world safely. What was more important, her hurt or her baby's health? The answer was painfully clear. She looked at Carlos, at the desperate and genuine plea in his eyes, and saw there not the ruthless businessman, but a terrified man. His armor had completely fallen away, and all that remained was a raw fear of losing her. With a sigh that carried the weight of her surrender, she whispered, her voice weak, "All right, Carlos, for Sophia, but on your terms, just housemates." The discharge from hospital 2 days later was an exercise in efficiency on Carlos's part. He handled all the bureaucracy with impressive speed, paying the astronomical bill without even looking at the numbers, as if he were buying a newspaper. He filled all the prescriptions at the hospital's own pharmacy and helped Isadora get out of bed and into the car with a care that bordered on reverence. The ride back from the hospital to his apartment was wrapped in a dense, uncomfortable silence, very different from the panic-filled silence of the trip there. Now, with the immediate crisis over, the reality of the agreement they had made hung between them like a fog. Isadora looked out the window, watching the familiar and modest neighborhoods of her life give way to the wide, tree-lined streets and imposing buildings of the city's elite. It was like being abducted into a parallel reality, one she had once dreamed of belonging to, but which now seemed strange and hostile. She felt like a refugee, and the irony of being a refugee in the life of the man she had fled from was almost unbearable. Carlos, for his part, kept his hands firm on the steering wheel, but inside he was a pit of anxiety. He had her there, safe, but now the real test began. To prove that his intentions were pure, that he could be the caregiver she needed without becoming the tyrant he once was. The arrival at Carlos's penthouse was a shock to Isadora's system. The apartment was gigantic, a palace of glass, steel, and marble, with a minimalist decor that screamed wealth but whispered loneliness. It was a space clearly built by a single man, a place that held no ghosts of their past, which in a way was even more alienating. Carlos, sensing her discomfort, acted with a gentleness that surprised her. He took her directly to what would be her room, a spacious suite with a king-size bed, a walk-in closet, and a balcony with a spectacular view of the city. "This is your space, Isadora, totally yours," he said. He had already sent for her few clothes and personal belongings from her old apartment, which were now carefully stored in the closet. "The kitchen and the living room are ours. My room is on the other side of the apartment," he pointed out, establishing a geography of distance. "I won't bother you. Just rest. If you need anything at all, call me." With that, he withdrew, leaving her alone in that luxurious and silent room. Isadora sat on the edge of the soft bed, the silence of the place so profound she could hear her own heart beating. She was safe, comfortable, but she felt more displaced and lonelier than ever. The first few days in the apartment were a study in distance and silence. Carlos moved through the house with the lightness of a ghost, terrified of breaking the fragile truce they had established. He took on the role of caregiver with an almost monastic dedication. Meals appeared at regular times on the kitchen island, nutritious dishes designed for her needs, always accompanied by a glass of fresh juice. He didn't call her to eat, didn't insist they join each other at the table. He simply left the food there, a silent offering that gave her the freedom to eat in her room if she so desired. The blood pressure medications and prenatal vitamins were arranged by him on a tray, with the times noted on a slip of paper in impeccable handwriting. Isadora would hear from her sanctuary the echoes of his old life, important conference calls being held in the office across the hall, but she also noticed what had changed. He cancelled meetings, delegated responsibilities, and for the first time in all the years she had known him, his empire seemed to have been demoted to second place. First place, unquestionably, was the mission to keep her safe. Isadora, for her part, spent the first few days in a state of self-imposed exile, leaving her room only when necessary. She observed Carlos's actions with the skeptical gaze of someone waiting for a mistake. The first crack in the Good Samaritan facade. She waited for impatience, for an explosion of his old temper, for a veiled demand, but nothing came. What she saw was a relentless consistency and a respect for her space that disarmed her. One night, unable to sleep, she ventured into the dark living room, expecting to find it empty. Instead, she found Carlos sitting in an armchair under the dim light of a lamp. He wasn't on his laptop or on the phone. He was reading a book. When she got a little closer, she could read the title on the cover, Parenthood for Beginners, the complete guide to the first year. The sight of that man, who once barely had time for his own marriage, studying how to care for a baby that wasn't even his, struck Isadora with unexpected force. What are you reading?" she asked, her voice sounding loud in the silence. He was startled, looking almost embarrassed to have been caught. "Oh, hi, just trying to understand a little more about all this," he replied, gesturing vaguely to the book and her belly. It was their first conversation, not born of crisis or negotiation, and the small moment of vulnerability hung in the air between them, fragile and precious. That moment of shared vulnerability in the dead of night was like a key turning in a rusty lock. The tension that had once filled the empty spaces of the apartment began to dissipate, slowly, being replaced by a cautious curiosity. The next morning, something changed. Instead of leaving the breakfast tray on the threshold of Isadora's door, Carlos placed it on the large dining table in the living room with two place settings. When Isadora came out of her room, he was in the kitchen, pretending to be busy with the coffee maker, and said as casually as he could manage, "Good morning, I made coffee and pancakes. If you want to eat here, I'd like the company. But if you'd prefer to take it to your room, no problem." The offer was unpretentious, but the invitation was clear. Isadora hesitated for a long moment, her self-protective instinct battling a newfound desire for a sliver of normalcy. In the end, the image of him reading about babies won the battle. She walked slowly to the table and sat in the chair opposite his. The first breakfast they shared was mostly silent, but it was no longer a silence of strangeness. It was a silence of observation, the sound of two wounded souls learning to breathe the same air again. Breakfast became dinner, and dinner became a routine. The meals, which began in silence, were gradually filled with words. At first they were safe, mundane topics. The weather, a movie he watched, a news story. But as the days turned into weeks, the conversations deepened, like roots searching for water in dry soil. Carlos, with a visible effort to shed his arrogance, began to talk about his work not with pride, but with an honest weariness, confessing how empty the corporate victories seemed now. This unexpected openness gave Isadora the courage to open her own floodgates. She began to talk about Sophia, about her little kicks and movements, about her fears of childbirth, about her dreams for the girl. She didn't talk about the child's father, a painful chapter that remained closed, but she talked about herself, about her hopes, and Carlos listened. He didn't offer solutions or money. He simply listened, asked questions, remembered details. He asked about the layette, about the colors she imagined for the baby's room. He was becoming an active participant in the pregnancy, not as a benefactor, but as a partner. And for Isadora, who had spent her entire pregnancy in absolute solitude, having someone to share those small joys and anxieties with was a gift more valuable than any luxury penthouse. The partnership born at the dinner table soon overflowed into the rest of the apartment, breaking the geography of distance Carlos had imposed. One evening, as Isadora described with a sparkle in her eye, the kind of crib she had always dreamed of for her daughter, an idea sprouted in Carlos's mind, so bold he almost dismissed it. But the new Carlos, the man who secretly read parenting books, was braver. "Isadora," he interrupted gently, "this apartment has rooms to spare. One of them is empty, collecting dust. What do you think? What do you think about us setting up Sophia's room? Here, the two of us." He braced himself for refusal, but saw the astonishment on her face turn into something he hadn't seen in years. A flash of pure joy. The opportunity to build a nest, to prepare a space for her daughter, was a desire she had buried under layers of worry and need. "You would do that?" she asked, her voice little more than a whisper. "We will do that," he corrected, with a soft smile. The next day, the large dining table was covered not with plates, but with catalogs, color samples, and a laptop open to children's furniture websites. For the first time, they weren't dealing with the past or surviving the present. They were building together a piece of the future. It was during one of these planning sessions, while browsed through models of crib mobiles, that the past and the future collided. One of the mobiles played a soft melody, a classic lullaby. Upon hearing the first chords, they both stopped simultaneously. Their eyes met over the laptop screen, and in an instant, they were no longer in the luxurious penthouse in 2025. They were back in their old small apartment years ago, lying in bed. On a Sunday afternoon, daydreaming, he vividly remembered saying, "When we have a child, I want one of these mobiles with glow-in-the-dark stars playing this music." Isadora remembered her reply, "And I'll paint little clouds on the ceiling, so he'll think he's sleeping outdoors." The memory was so sharp, so bittersweet, that Isadora's breath caught in her throat. The housemates' agreement seemed like a ridiculous fiction in the face of the power of that shared moment. "I remember," Carlos whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I remember too," she replied. Instinctively, he reached his hand across the table and covered hers with his. It was not a gesture of possession or passion, but of deep connection, a silent acknowledgement of a dream they had lost, and that, maybe, just maybe, they were finding again. Carlos's hand on hers was the first drop of rain after a long drought, and after it, the flood was inevitable. The project of Sophia's room became the center of their universe. The boxes of furniture began to arrive, and the empty room transformed into a blank canvas for the future they were painting together. On a weekend, dressed in old clothes, they dedicated themselves to painting the walls a soft yellow, the color Isadora had chosen. The smell of fresh paint filled the apartment, an aroma of a new beginning. They laughed truly for the first time in years when Carlos, trying to reach a high corner, lost his balance and smudged Isadora's nose with paint. She retaliated, and for a few minutes they became two children, forgetful of their pains, in the midst of a war of colorful splatters. Carlos, the tycoon who commanded multi-million-dollar meetings, was on his knees on the floor, sweating and cursing under his breath as he tried to decipher the instruction manual to assemble the crib. And Isadora, watching him, felt the last wall of her distrust crumble to dust. She was no longer falling in love with the memory of the man he had been, but with the man right there, dedicated, patient, and undeniably happy to be building something priceless. With the room finally ready, a masterpiece of love and teamwork, a new peace settled between them. One night, already at the beginning of Isadora's 9th month of pregnancy, they stood in the doorway of the small sanctuary they had created. The stars he had promised years ago glowed on the ceiling, and a mobile of clouds and moons spun silently over the empty crib. That room was the physical proof of their reconciliation. Carlos turned to her, the expression on his face a mixture of love, fear, and hope. "Isadora," he began, his voice trembling, "I know what we agreed, housemates. But I'm not your housemate. I love you. I never stopped loving you. I was just too stupid to realize it. I love the incredible woman you've become, and I already love Sophia with every fiber of my being. I don't want to be an arrangement. I want to be your partner, your husband, and I want to be Sophia's father, in every sense, if you and she will have me." The tears Isadora had been holding back rolled freely down her face. "I love you too, Carlos," she answered, her voice choked with emotion. "I love the man you've become." She took his hand and placed it on her belly at the exact moment Sophia gave a strong kick. "I think she accepts too." At that moment, under the glow of the plastic stars, their family was born, long before the official arrival of its newest member. The week following their declaration was a glimpse of the paradise they had lost. The formality disappeared completely, replaced by an easy and comfortable intimacy. They walked hand in hand through the apartment, cooked together, and Isadora even convinced him to help her fold the tiny baby clothes they had bought, a task the clumsy tycoon performed with hilarious concentration. One night, while they were watching a movie in the living room, with Isadora's head comfortably resting on Carlos's shoulder, the tranquility was suddenly broken. Isadora straightened up with a jolt, letting out a sharp cry and bringing both hands to her belly. Carlos leaped from the couch, his heart instantly racing. "What is it? Another contraction?" he asked, concern already creasing his forehead. Isadora looked at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of pain and shock, and then looked down. A stream of liquid was running down her legs, soaking the expensive leather sofa. "Carlos," she said, her voice trembling but firm, "my water broke. I think Sophia is coming." Panic threatened to take over Carlos, but he crushed it. He had read the books. He was prepared. This was not the time for fear, it was the time for action. This time, the trip to the hospital was a ballet of controlled urgency, very different from the first chaotic and desperate journey. Carlos, with a calm that surprised himself, grabbed the hospital bag they had packed together the week before and placed it near the door. He helped Isadora up, wrapping an arm around her as she leaned on him, panting with the intensity of a new contraction. They were no longer a savior and a victim. They were a team. In the car, the dynamic was different. Carlos drove fast, but safely, while holding Isadora's hand firmly with his other hand. "That's it, my love. Breathe deeply. Like we practiced. You're doing great," he said, his tone firm and encouraging. He timed the contractions on the car's dashboard, his voice a calming mantra amidst her pain. Isadora squeezed his hand with each new wave, the fear of prematurity mixing with the pain. But loneliness, her old and most feared ghost, was nowhere to be found. She was not alone. She was with her partner, her safe harbor. When they arrived at the same hospital emergency entrance, they were no longer a broken man and a helpless woman. They were parents, united, and ready to face whatever came next to bring their daughter into the world. The entrance to the hospital this time was that of a united front. The medical team, already familiar with Isadora's case and Carlos's influence, acted promptly, taking her immediately to a private birthing suite. The hours that followed were a blur of pain, exhaustion, and unwavering love. Carlos never left her side. He became the personification of everything he had read in the books. He held her hand with a strength that was both physical and emotional, whispered words of encouragement in her ear with each contraction, wiped the sweat from her forehead with a damp towel, and was her firm voice with the nurses, ensuring her every need was met. He breathed with her, felt her pain as if it were his own. However, as the hours passed, the atmosphere in the room began to change. The concern on the faces of the medical team became more evident. The beeps of the fetal monitor, which had been a comforting sound, became erratic, with Sophia's little heart dangerously decelerating with each contraction. The progression of labor stalled. Isadora was exhausted, her strength fading, and the baby was beginning to show signs that she wouldn't hold on for much longer. Finally, the obstetrician entered the room with the serious expression they had feared. He sat beside the bed, explaining the situation with a calm but urgent clarity. "Isadora, Carlos, labor is not progressing, and Sophia's heart rate is dropping worryingly with each contraction. She is in distress. At this point, insisting on a vaginal birth would be a risk I'm not willing to take. The safest option for both of you is an emergency cesarean section. Fear chilled Isadora's blood. Surgery. It wasn't supposed to be like this. She looked at Carlos, her eyes full of panic. He, sensing her terror, acted instantly. He held her face between his hands, forcing her to look at him. "Hey, my love, look at me," he said, his firm voice overriding the fear. "We trust this doctor. The only thing that matters is that our daughter arrives safely. I'm not going anywhere. I'm going in there with you. I'll hold your hand the whole time. We're going to meet our daughter together, do you hear me?" His certainty was the anchor she needed. She nodded, tears streaming. In minutes, the room filled with movement. Isadora was prepped for surgery, while a nurse handed Carlos a set of surgical scrubs. As she was being taken to the operating room, he leaned over and kissed her forehead. "I love you. I'll see you in a few seconds." The gleam of silver cutlery and the muffled sound of conversations filled the air of the city's most exclusive restaurant, a place that for Carlos symbolized the pinnacle of his success. At 38, he was the personification of victory, a financial empire built on the ashes of a painful past, and, at his side, Camilla, a model whose beauty seemed just another of his trophies. While she talked about a fashion campaign in Milan, Carlos's eyes wandered through the room, bored, until they stopped on a figure that made his heart freeze. A waitress, moving, with the visible weariness of someone carrying a burden, turned under the light, and Carlos's world collapsed. It was Isadora, his ex-wife, her simple uniform stretched over the unmistakable belly of a 7-month pregnancy. In that instant, the restaurant's noise disappeared, and all he could feel was the echo of the laughter they had once shared at those very same tables. Isadora saw him the exact moment he walked in. A chill ran down her spine, a mixture of panic and humiliation that she swallowed dryly, forcing herself to continue serving the next table. Every step she took seemed to weigh a ton, conscious of his gaze burning her back. She was no longer the woman he had known. Life had hardened her. The abandonment by her daughter's father had forced her to find a strength she didn't know she possessed. Inside Carlos, a war was raging. The image of Isadora, so vulnerable and yet so dignified in her silent struggle, exposed the futility of his own life. Every million in his bank account, every luxury trip, every empty compliment from Camilla, all turned to dust before the crushing reality that he had traded the only woman he ever loved for a mountain of soulless things. Guilt was a poison, rising in his throat and slowly suffocating him. The operating room was a world apart, a cold, pale green universe illuminated by blinding lights and filled with the rhythmic and constant sound of monitors. For Isadora, lying on the table, all that existed was Carlos's face, hovering above hers, his eyes being the only anchor in a sea of anxiety. He, dressed in surgical scrubs, held her hand firmly, the other stroking her hair, away from her face damp with sweat and tears. He whispered to her, maintaining a narrative of calm and love that blocked out the noise of the instruments and the technical voices of the medical team. "They've already started, my love. You won't feel a thing. Think about us. Think about her room. Think about her little face," he said. Isadora clung to every word. Time became elastic, the minutes dragging on into an eternity of waiting. Then, from over the surgical drape, the obstetrician's voice rang out, clear and triumphant. "Here she is!" A moment of tense silence followed, the longest of Carlos and Isadora's lives. And then, the sound, a sharp, strong, and life-filled cry, which tore through the sterile silence of the room and filled every inch with the purest, most overwhelming hope. The relief was a physical wave that hit them. Both broke down in convulsive, happy sobs. While the pediatric team quickly tended to the tiny newborn, the doctor turned to Carlos, handing him a pair of surgical scissors. "Congratulations, Dad. Want to do the honors?" With trembling hands but a will of steel, Carlos leaned over and cut the umbilical cord, the final symbolic act that forever bound him to that little life. Minutes later, a smiling nurse approached with a small bundle of pink blankets. "She's perfect. Want to hold your... a daughter?" And then they placed her in his arms. Sophia. Carlos's world, his empire, his ambitions, his past pains, everything disintegrated and reformed at that exact moment. Her weight in his arms was insignificant, and at the same time, it was the most profound and meaningful burden he had ever felt. She stopped crying, and her dark little eyes, still swollen, opened. He felt the tiny grip of her fingers on his index finger and was struck by a love so instantaneous, so primitive and unconditional that it left him breathless. This was not another man's child he was choosing to love. She was his. In every fiber of his being, she was his daughter. He brought her close to Isadora so she could kiss the baby's forehead. "I promise, Sophia," he whispered, his voice choked. "I will take care of you both for the rest of my life." Back in the hospital room, the adrenaline of the surgery gave way to an exhausted and sacred peace. Isadora, recovering from the anesthesia, felt weak, but her heart was stronger and fuller than ever. Sophia slept in a small acrylic bassinet next to the bed, a miniature miracle. Carlos, for his part, refused to go home, or even to sleep on the comfortable sofa bed in the room. He dragged an uncomfortable armchair to Isadora's bedside, creating a vigil between the woman he loved and the daughter he had just met. He became a scholar of Sophia. He spent hours just watching her, memorizing every feature of her face, the way her lips moved in her sleep, the dark fuzz on her head. When she whimpered, he was the first to get up, heart pounding, and try to decipher her needs. He pestered the nurses with questions, learning to change diapers with a concentration he once dedicated to multi-million-dollar contracts, discovering the best way to hold her to calm a bout of hiccups. Isadora watched it all, her chest full of an emotion so overwhelming it hurt. The man who was once absent and self-centered had transformed before her eyes into a devoted and present father, and this was the final proof that their love had not just been restored but reborn, stronger and truer than it had ever been. The days in the hospital became the first training ground for their new life. The nights, in particular, were a baptism by fire and by love. Every 2 hours, Sophia would wake up, and the routine of feeding, burping, and changing diapers would begin. Carlos and Isadora became a perfectly synchronized team, moving in the dim light of the room with a silent communication based on looks and gestures. While Isadora breastfed, it was Carlos who adjusted the pillows behind her back and brought her a glass of water, stroking her shoulder in a gesture of support. Afterwards, it was he who would pick up Sophia with impressive gentleness and spend long minutes walking around the room to burp her. In those early mornings, exhausted, with deep dark circles under their eyes, but with their hearts overflowing, they found a new and more profound form of intimacy. Sharing the burden and joy of those first nights was more unifying than any romantic dinner or expensive gift. Isadora saw the unwavering devotion in Carlos's tired eyes and felt the last remnant of fear or doubt dissolve. She not only loved him, she trusted him with her life, and more importantly, with her daughter's life. He wasn't just fulfilling a promise. He was living it with every changed diaper, every interrupted night of sleep. The day of the hospital discharge was bathed in a soft sunlight that seemed to celebrate with them. The departure was an event of organized calm and happiness. Carlos, who days before barely knew what to do with his own hands, now moved with the confidence of a veteran father. He buckled Sophia into her baby car seat, a state-of-the-art piece of equipment he had researched and installed in the car himself, with a delicacy and precision that made a nurse smile in approval. He helped Isadora, who was still moving with the discomfort of the C-section, to settle into the passenger seat, ensuring she was comfortable before closing the door. The drive home was the polar opposite of the 2 previous trips to the same hospital. Carlos drove his powerful sports car with the slowness and caution of a limousine driver transporting royalty, coming to a complete stop at yellow lights and maintaining an exaggerated distance from other vehicles. Every jolt from the street was a personal offense. Isadora watched him, a tender smile on her lips. The man who once lived on the edge of speed and risk now drove as if his entire universe were contained in that car. And in fact, for him, it was. Upon re-entering the penthouse, the atmosphere of the place was unrecognizable. Isadora vividly remembered the first time she had stepped inside, weeks before. On that occasion, the apartment had swallowed her with its cold vastness, its oppressive silence, and its solitary opulence. She had felt like a prisoner in a golden cage. Now, it was different. Sophia's presence, even sleeping peacefully in her car seat, filled every corner with a warmth and purpose that hadn't existed before. The silence was no longer one of loneliness, but of peace. The minimalist living room no longer seemed empty, but rather awaiting activity mats and scattered toys. Carlos carried the car seat as if it were the most fragile treasure in the world and took it directly to the yellow room they had prepared. He and Isadora stood there, side by side, shoulder to shoulder, watching their daughter sleep in her own crib for the first time. In that moment, the spell was broken. This was no longer Carlos's apartment. It was their home, the place where their family would grow. Life in the penthouse settled into a rhythm dictated by the schedule of a tiny human being. The first few weeks were a whirlwind of diapers, feedings, and sleepless nights. But for Carlos and Isadora, it was the most welcome chaos in the world. Carlos's financial empire was put on autopilot. His home office accumulated a thin layer of dust as he became an expert in other areas. The exact temperature of a baby's bath, the art of burping a newborn, and the miraculous power of a lullaby sung in an off-key whisper. He became the guardian of the early mornings, insisting that Isadora sleep to recover from the surgery, and would spend hours walking through the living room with Sophia in his arms, telling her about his plans for the future, or simply describing the city lights. Outside, the penthouse, once a symbol of his loneliness, now echoed with the sounds of a family life. Sophia's cry, Isadora's tired laughter, and the deep, loving voice of Carlos, who had finally found his true, safe harbor. Seeing that powerful and once inaccessible man surrendered in love for his daughter was, for Isadora, the final cure for all her past wounds. One evening, after they finally managed to get Sophia to sleep in her crib, Carlos and Isadora sat on the sofa, a comfortable silence. Between them, Carlos watched her, his heart so full of love and gratitude it felt like it would burst. He took her hand, intertwining their fingers. "You know, I've never been so happy in my entire life," he said, his voice low and sincere. "Every second of this exhaustion, every moment, is worth more than all the money I've ever made." He took a deep breath, gathering the courage for the question that had been forming in his mind for weeks. "Isadora, I want Sophia to have my name. I want to adopt her legally. I want the whole world to know she is my daughter, just as I already know in here." Tears welled up in Isadora's eyes, but he wasn't finished yet. "And I want to marry you again. Not for appearances, not with a giant party, something just for us. To seal this, so that we are a family in every sense of the word, before the law and before ourselves. Marry me again, Isa?" This time, there was no hesitation, no distrust. Isadora threw herself into his arms, her tears of joy, soaking his shirt shoulder. "Yes," she whispered in his ear. "Yes to everything. Yes." Moved by his new determination, Carlos acted with the speed and efficiency that had made him a millionaire. He hired the best family law team in the city, not to intimidate or rush the process, but to ensure that every step was followed with the utmost respect and care. For Carlos, the meetings in law offices and the trips to the courthouse were more important than any negotiation he had ever made. They were the construction of the most important legacy of his life. Isadora accompanied him with Sophia in her arms, feeling a wave of gratitude at every stage. She remembered the humiliation and fear when Sophia's biological father abandoned her, and the contrast with what was happening now was overwhelming. Carlos was not just accepting her daughter, he was moving heaven and earth to claim her as his own. The final moment came in a judge's sober chamber. Upon hearing the gavel fall and the sentence that officially declared Sophia as Carlos's daughter, with his last name added to her birth certificate, Carlos felt an emotion that surpassed closing any deal. He looked at the document, at his name next to Isadora's as the parents of that little girl, and knew he had finally found the true definition of wealth. Their second wedding was the opposite of their first. The first had been a grand event for hundreds of people, a display of status and power that, in retrospect, seemed empty and performative. This time, the ceremony took place in the living room of their penthouse, the space that had been the stage for his redemption, and was now the heart of their home. The only guests were the justice of the peace, and, as the silent and most important witness, Sophia, who slept peacefully in her crib. They wrote their own vows. Carlos, his voice choked with emotion, spoke of how he had been lost in the darkness of his own ambition, and how the sight of Isadora, pregnant and strong, was the light that guided him back home. He didn't promise luxury, he promised presence. He didn't promise perfection, he promised patience. Isadora, in turn, spoke of the strength she found in loneliness and how Carlos's resilient love taught her to trust again. She promised to love the man he was now, not the ghost of the past, and to build with him a family based on truth. When the justice declared them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was calm, deep, and laden with the weight and beauty of all they had overcome. It was the silent celebration of a hard-won victory. Sophia's first year of life was also the first year of Carlos and Isadora's new life. Time, which was once measured in market closings and profit targets, was now counted in new and precious increments. Sophia's first smile, a gift directed at Isadora, the first time she rolled over on the living room rug under Carlos's watchful eye, the first word, a babbled "dada," that made Carlos's heart melt and turned him into a puddle of emotion on the kitchen floor. Each small milestone was a celebration. Carlos deliberately rearranged his entire professional life to be present. He was the father who was home to see his daughter's first wobbly steps, his arms open to catch her fall, his face exploding with a pride that no company acquisition had ever given him. Isadora, flourishing in this environment of love and security, also rediscovered herself. The strength she had used to survive was now used to thrive. With Carlos's encouragement, she enrolled in an online culinary course, rekindling a passion for creating that the hard life had tried to extinguish. The dynamic between them also matured, far from the fragile passion of youth and the bitter resentment of separation. They found a balance of true partnership. They learned the art of communication to navigate the small disagreements that life with a third person inevitably brings. A discussion about Sophia's sleep training methods, which in the past might have turned into a war of accusations and wounded pride, was now resolved with a patient conversation late at night, where both sides were heard and a middle ground was found. They weren't perfect, but they were a team. Carlos learned that love wasn't about grand gestures, but about taking his turn to change a particularly challenging diaper at 3 in the morning, so Isadora could rest. Isadora learned that trust wasn't about never feeling fear again, but about knowing there was a strong, gentle hand to hold hers in the dark. They were, brick by brick, building not just a family, but a fortress of love and mutual respect. The corporate world, which had once been Carlos's only stage, now seemed like a distant galaxy. His reputation had transformed from ruthless shark to eccentric recluse. On a Saturday morning, the living proof of this change materialized in a park near his apartment, while Carlos, in jeans and a t-shirt, was on all fours in the sand, making a crooked castle for a giggling Sophia who was trying to eat the sand. A voice called him. "Carlos, is that really you?" It was Ricardo, an old rival and partner on a major project, a man who personified Carlos's former life. Ricardo looked at him, shocked, unable to reconcile the image of the man covered in sand with the titan he had known. "What happened to you? I thought you were in Dubai. We lost the contract because of you," Ricardo said with an accusatory tone. Carlos stood up, brushed the sand off his pants and smiled, a genuine smile with no trace of arrogance. "I didn't lose anything, Ricardo. In fact, I've never gained so much in my life." He pointed to Isadora, who was approaching with a water bottle. "This is my wife, Isadora, and this little architect here is my daughter, Sophia, my real empire." Ricardo was speechless, looking at the scene of happy domesticity as if he were looking at an unsolvable equation. The Carlos he knew was dead and buried, and in his place was a man who measured his success not in contracts, but in smiles. The last ghost of his past life was exorcised on an ordinary day, in an almost banal way. While flipping through a magazine in a pediatrician's waiting room for Sophia's routine checkup, Carlos came across a 2-page spread. It was an ad for an expensive perfume, and the face staring back at him was Camilla's. She was stunning, ethereal, the personification of a cold and unattainable beauty. For an instant, Isadora, who was beside him, felt a pang of insecurity, watching his face for any trace of nostalgia or regret. Carlos looked at the photo for a long moment, his expression neutral. He saw the perfection of the image, the luxury, the glamour, and then he heard a small sneeze beside him. It was Sophia, who had a little juice dripping down her chin. He turned to her, took a tissue, and wiped her little face with infinite tenderness. Then his eyes met Isadora's. He said nothing. He just smiled, a smile that said everything, and closed the magazine with a definitive gesture. The omniscient narrator knew what he was thinking. The beauty of that page was an illusion, a product. Real beauty was there, beside him, with a slightly tired face, hair tied in a simple bun, and a love in her eyes that was worth more than all the advertising campaigns in the world. The past had finally become just a photograph on a turned page. With the past firmly in its place, they dedicated themselves to coloring the present with new traditions. Sophia's first birthday was a milestone not only for her, but for the redefinition of what it meant for Carlos to celebrate. He remembered his own birthday parties, which were gala events with hundreds of guests, extravagant buffets, and a palpable sense of social obligation. His daughter's party was the exact opposite. It took place in their living room, now permanently baby-proofed, with a handful of colored balloons he had blown up himself until he was dizzy. The only guests were the three of them. Isadora, who now delighted in her kitchen, baked a chocolate cake that was a little lopsided, but was made with an amount of love no luxury bakery could replicate. They sang Happy Birthday, completely off-key, with Sophia clapping her hands in her high chair, more interested in the candle's flame than anything else. Carlos's gift was a simple wooden rocking horse that he spent a week assembling. Seeing her giggle, her face and hands completely smeared with frosting, while Isadora cried with emotion and joy, was for Carlos the image of the purest and most authentic happiness, a feeling he now knew was the only celebration that mattered. Their first Christmas as a family of 3 cemented this new reality. In previous years, Christmas for Carlos was a time of heightened loneliness, a holiday to escape on exotic trips or to endure at impersonal corporate parties. This year, he insisted they create their own traditions from scratch. Together, they went to pick out a real tree, and Carlos lifted a radiant Sophia onto his shoulders so she could place the star on top. The penthouse, once a minimalist temple, was invaded by twinkling lights, handmade ornaments, and the constant smell of pine and the gingerbread cookies Isadora baked. On Christmas Eve, there was no formal dinner. It was just the three of them, in pajamas, watching Christmas cartoons, with Sophia falling asleep on her father's lap. The next morning, seeing her joy as she tore open the wrapping paper, Carlos felt a peace that filled him completely. The most valuable gift was not in any of the boxes. It was that moment. It was the family he had built from ruins. Hugging his wife and daughter near the tree, he finally understood that the true spirit of Christmas had nothing to do with giving or receiving gifts, but with the blessing of being present. As family life flowed in a rhythm of steady happiness, Isadora felt an old, long-dormant desire begin to awaken. The kitchen, which had once been a reminder of her servile work, became her laboratory of joy. She completed her culinary course with honors and spent hours testing recipes, transforming simple ingredients into dishes that were true works of art and affection. One night, after presenting Carlos with a shrimp risotto so perfect it left him momentarily speechless, he looked at her with deep admiration. "Isadora, this is unbelievable. You have a gift, a genuine talent that the world needs to know." Encouraged by the gleam in his eyes, she confessed a dream she barely dared to verbalize to herself. "Sometimes," she began, her voice a little shy, "I dream of having my own place, a small, charming bistro, a place where the food hugs people, you know? No fuss, just flavor and coziness." The old Carlos might have offered to buy the place as one buys a ring, a whim. But the man before her saw the passion in her eyes and reacted with an enthusiasm that was entirely for her. "A bistro," he repeated, his face lighting up. "Isa, that's the best idea I've ever heard. And you're not just going to dream about it, we're going to make it happen." From that day on, a new project was born in the penthouse. Carlos used all his vast business experience not to take the lead, but to put himself at the service of Isadora's dream. He became her private consultant, her biggest fan, and her strategic partner. The dining table turned into a meeting room for two. She was the visionary, passionately describing every detail of the menu, the style of the decor, the ambient music, the name of the place. Ninho, nest, a refuge. He was the strategist, teaching her about cash flow, break-even point, marketing, and competitor analysis. He didn't do it for her. He taught her how to do it. He designed spreadsheets, researched suppliers, and helped her put together a business plan as solid as the ones he presented to his boards of directors. For Carlos, investing his time and knowledge in Isadora's dream was infinitely more rewarding than investing millions in the stock market. He was investing in the woman he loved, empowering her so she could fly with her own wings. Seeing her confidence flourish, watching her transform from a survivor into a passionate entrepreneur was the greatest proof that their love had evolved into a partnership of equals, where one's success was the other's joy. Life settled into a routine of such deep and calm happiness that sometimes they both had to stop to make sure it was real. On a Sunday afternoon, the apartment was bathed in golden sunlight. On the living room rug, Sophia, now almost 2 and with boundless energy, ran back and forth, handing one of her scribbles to Isadora and then running into Carlos's arms for a bear hug. Isadora, with her notebook for the Ninho bistro on her lap, and Carlos, with a children's book in his hand, exchanged a look over their daughter's head. In that silent gaze was a universe of understanding, gratitude, and a love so big it seemed too large to fit just the three of them. It was Isadora who broke the silence, her voice soft. "She is the best thing that ever happened to us. She saved us," she said, watching Sophia try to put on one of Carlos's shoes. "Sometimes I think our love has grown so much because of her that now it needs more space." Carlos understood immediately. He put down the book and moved closer, kneeling beside her. "I think about that every day," he confessed. "I think about giving her a brother or a sister, about filling this house with more laughter. I was just waiting for you, waiting for the right moment, for your dream." She smiled, placing her hand on his face. My dream is this family, Carlos. The bistro is a bonus. Our love is ready. Months later, their dream took shape. The confirmation of the second pregnancy was met not with the shock and fear of the first, but with tears of pure joy and a silent celebration between the couple. For Isadora, this pregnancy was a redemptive experience, a chance to rewrite a story that had been stained by pain. This time, there was no loneliness, only partnership. There was no fear of the future, only an exciting anticipation. Carlos treated her like the most delicate of queens. He went to every doctor's appointment, his eyes filling with tears as he saw the ultrasound images, his heart beating faster as he heard the baby's little heart. He took on even more of the household chores and Sophia's care, insisting that Isadora rest, that she dedicate herself to planning her bistro without stress, that she simply enjoy the miracle that was happening inside her. Each kick from the baby was no longer a reminder of her vulnerability, but a celebration of their love. She could finally experience the beauty of pregnancy in its fullness, safe, loved, and deeply at peace, knowing that the man by her side was not just her husband, but the tireless guardian of her happiness and her family. As Isadora's belly grew, her other dream also took shape. The Ninho Bistro went from being a business plan on a spreadsheet to a real brick-and-mortar space in a charming city neighborhood. Isadora supervised every detail, from the color of the walls to the choice of cutlery, with Carlos acting as her enthusiastic assistant and advisor. The opening night was a resounding success, not because of opulence, but because of authenticity. The place was full, not with socialites and tycoons, but with neighbors, friends, and lovers of good food, all drawn by the warmth emanating from the place. Isadora, with her prominent 8-month belly under her apron, commanded the kitchen with the grace of a maestro. Carlos, for his part, acted as the proudest of hosts. He was not the owner, he was the owner's husband. He greeted customers at the door, proudly told the story behind the restaurant's name, and spent most of his time just watching his wife shine, his heart overflowing with an admiration he had never felt for any CEO or president. He hadn't saved her. He had just loved her enough so she could save herself and, in the process, build something beautiful and all her own. That night, exhausted and happy, they returned to the penthouse. While Isadora rested her swollen feet on the sofa, Carlos opened a bottle of non-alcoholic sparkling wine so they could toast. To Ninho, he said, raising his glass, to the most talented chef this city has ever seen. Isadora smiled, her eyes shining. I couldn't have done it without you, Carlos. And I'm not talking about the money. I'm talking about your faith in me. You gave me the support I needed to believe in myself. He shook his head, taking her hand. I just held the lantern, my love. The path, the map, and the courage were all yours. I've never been so proud in my entire life. He then placed his free hand on her belly, where a vigorous kick could be felt. And now, our next big project is almost ready for its grand opening, he joked. They laughed, a soft, complicit sound. Looking out the window at the city lights, Carlos realized that the world he had fought so hard to conquer out there was nothing compared to the infinite universe of love, dreams, and family he had built within those walls. 2 years had passed since that fateful night in the restaurant. 2 years that felt like a lifetime of rediscovery. On a lazy Saturday afternoon, the penthouse, which had once been a sanctuary of silence and loneliness, was filled with the sweet sounds of life. Sophia, now a chatty 2-year-old girl with bright eyes, was sitting on the floor, nestled between Carlos's legs, as he read one of her picture books for the 10th time, making funny voices for each animal. Isadora watched the scene from the kitchen doorway, a serene smile on her face and her hand resting on her belly, now prominently round, housing the couple's second child. She walked over to them, and Sophia immediately stretched out her little arms, wanting her mother to join the reading. Circle. Isadora sat down, and Carlos wrapped an arm around her, kissing the top of her head. In that simple, perfect moment, with their daughter between them and their son on the way, the circle of their family was complete and unbreakable. There were no more ghosts, only the promise of a bright future. Carlos looked at his daughter's face, then at his wife's, and then at the belly that carried his son. A deep clarity, the greatest epiphany of his journey, took hold of him. "I spent so many years," he said, his voice low, almost reverent, "believing that wealth was power. It was having my name on skyscrapers. It was the number in my bank account. I measured my worth by the ability to acquire things." He paused, pulling Isadora a little closer. "What a fool I was. Wealth is this. It's the smell of our daughter's hair after her bath. It's the sound of her laughter when I make a funny face. It's feeling our son kick inside you. It's knowing that, at the end of the day, I come home to you." Carlos's journey was not just about winning back a lost love, but about finding himself. He needed to see his old life reflected in the depths of Isadora's tired eyes to realize how empty it was. The love he had almost destroyed was not just repaired. It was forged in the fire of adversity and reborn, stronger, wiser, and infinitely more valuable. His true empire was not made of steel and glass, but of love, forgiveness, and the deep, immutable truth that the only fortune that truly matters is family.